The scent of pine and rotting wood had become a strange sort of comfort. It was the smell of isolation, the perfume of my failure. Here, in the dilapidated hunter's cabin my grandfather had built and then forgotten, the world could not find me. More importantly, the pack could not find me. Tonight was the choosing. The one night every 5 years when the unmated alphas of the territory gathered to claim their omegas. For most, it was a night of heady anticipation and hope. For me, it was a sentence I had been fleeing my entire life. I ran a thumb over the cool metal of the pendant resting against my collarbone. It was a simple silver disc, worn smooth with time, etched with the shape of a crescent moon cradling a single perfect star. It was my mother's, the only thing I had left of her. Elindra had pressed it into my hand the night she died, her eyes wide with a feverish urgency I hadn't understood. "It will protect you, Mirren," she had whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Your silence is not a weakness, it is a shield. Remember that. When the time comes, they will not hear you. They will feel you." Her words had made no sense then, and they made little more now. My silence was the pack's term for my defect, while every other wolf, from the mightiest alpha to the lowest-ranking omega, carried a distinct personal scent that broadcast their status, their emotions, their very essence. I had almost nothing. My scent was muted, faint, like a watercolor painting left in the rain. It was barely there, lavender and chamomile, a ghost of a fragrance that the other wolves found unnerving and incomplete. Broken. That's what they called me, the broken omega. I was useless, unable to signal submission or readiness, unable to participate in the complex olfactory language that governed our society. I was rejected before I could even be considered. A gust of wind rattled the cabin's lone window, and I flinched, my heart hammering against my ribs. Down in the valley, the ceremonial bonfires would be roaring, casting flickering shadows against the faces of hopeful omegas and predatory alphas. I could almost hear the low, rumbling growls of dominance, smell the cloying mix of arousal and fear that would be saturating the air. Here, there was only the damp earth, the sharp tang of pine needles, and the cold, metallic scent of my own anxiety. I was an outcast, a secret shame my pack was happy to ignore as long as I stayed hidden. And I was more than happy to oblige. I was 19. Most omegas my age were already mated, some with their first pups. I was still just Mirren, a ghost haunting the edges of a world I could never truly belong to. The thought was a familiar ache, a hollow space in my chest that had been carved out by years of whispers, of averted eyes, of being left behind. I pulled my thin blanket tighter around my shoulders, the rough wool scratching my chin. It was better this way. To be alone was to be safe. To be forgotten was to be free. I repeated the words like a mantra, a desperate prayer to a moon I could not see. Then, a sound cut through the sighing of the wind. It was thin and high-pitched, completely alien to the noises of the forest night. A cry. It was a child's cry, sharp with distress and fear. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. No one ever came this far up the mountain, especially not on the night of the choosing. Children were kept close, bundled up, and guarded within the village proper. The cry came again, closer this time, followed by a desperate sob that tore at something deep inside me. It wasn't the sound of a wild animal. It was the sound of a lost little boy. My carefully constructed solitude shattered. The fear for my own safety was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But it was overshadowed by a fierce, inexplicable surge of concern. I couldn't just sit here and listen to a child suffer. My mother's lessons, the ones about kindness to the small and the weak, were more deeply ingrained than my own survival instinct. Taking a deep, unsteadying breath, I grabbed the small skinning knife I kept by the hearth, a laughably futile weapon, and unbarred the heavy wooden door. The night air was cold, biting at my exposed skin. It carried the distant scent of the ceremonial fires, wood smoke and something else. Something powerful and electric, like an approaching storm. I ignored it, my ears straining to pinpoint the source of the crying. "Hello?" I called out, my voice thin and reedy from disuse. It was swallowed by the vast darkness. A sniffle answered me from a thicket of ferns a dozen yards away. I moved slowly, my bare feet sinking into the damp moss. The knife felt cold and foolish in my hand. What was I going to do? Fight off a bear? The child was my only concern. Pushing aside a large, wet frond, I saw him. He was small, no more than 4 or 5 years old, with a mop of dark, unruly hair that fell into his eyes. He was dressed in clothes far too fine for the woods. A velvet tunic and soft leather breeches, now smudged with dirt and tears. His face was pale, his cheeks flushed with cold and streaked with grime. But it was his eyes that held me captive. They were the color of molten amber, wide with terror, and they shimmered with a strange, unnatural light. And his scent. It was a storm in a teacup. Ozone, pine, and a faint, terrifying echo of something ancient and dominant. It was the scent of royalty. My blood ran cold. This was no ordinary pup. This was lichen nobility. This close to the valley, on this specific night. Dread coiled in my gut. The boy looked up at me, his sobs catching in his throat. He hiccuped, wiping his nose on his expensive sleeve. He didn't seem to notice my lack of scent. Or if he did, he didn't care. He just saw a person who wasn't a looming tree or a dark shadow. "Are you lost?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I crouched down, setting the useless knife on the hide ground to show I meant no harm. He nodded, his lower lip trembling. I was running. It got loud. "The fires," I murmured, understanding. The sensory overload of the choosing could be overwhelming even for adults. For a sensitive pup, it must have been terrifying. "It's okay. You're safe now." I held out a hand, palm up. It was a gesture of peace, one I had used many times to soothe frightened squirrels and stray cats. The boy hesitated for only a second before his small, cold hand slipped into mine. His grip was surprisingly strong. The moment our skin touched, a strange warmth bloomed in my chest, a quiet hum that seemed to flow from me to him. The amber glow in his eyes softened, the frantic energy coiling around him easing like a loosened spring. He took a shaky breath and leaned against my knee, the tension finally leaving his small frame. We stayed like that for a moment, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the boy's quiet sniffles. The protective feeling I'd felt earlier intensified, wrapping around him like a shield. I had no idea who he was, but in that moment, he was mine to protect. And then the world went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The crickets stopped. The wind died. The very air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that made my ears pop. A scent rolled through the trees, a tidal wave of raw power that obliterated the familiar smells of the forest. It was pine and rich earth, yes, but threaded with the metallic tang of lightning and the deep, musky aroma of a predator at the apex of its power. It was the scent I'd caught on the wind earlier, magnified 1,000 times. It was the scent of absolute authority, the scent of a king. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I scrambled to my feet, pulling the boy behind me. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my throat. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to hide, to become one with the shadows. But the small hand clutching mine was an anchor. I could not abandon him. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched on the forest floor, each one a thunderclap in the unnatural stillness. They weren't the rushed steps of a worried father, but the measured, relentless pace of a hunter closing in on his quarry. A figure emerged from the darkness, and the breath I was holding escaped in a terrified gasp. He was a giant, taller than any man I had ever seen, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the night sky. He was dressed in dark, severe leathers that made no sound as he moved. A crown of polished iron, stark and brutal, rested on his head, his dark hair brushing its edges. But it was his face that stole the air from my lungs. It was a mask of hard lines and sharp angles, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. And his eyes? They were not amber like the boy's, but a piercing, luminous silver that seemed to see right through the flesh and into the trembling soul beneath. King Theron, the Shadow Wolf King, ruler of all territories, a lycan of mythic power who had ascended to the throne after his father's brutal death in the wilderness. Stories of his ferocity were whispered by firelight, tales of him tearing his enemies apart with his bare hands. He was a force of nature, a walking embodiment of dominance, and he was standing 10 feet away from me. His silver eyes scanned the clearing, missing nothing. They passed over me first, dismissive, searching. Then they landed on the small boy partially hidden behind my legs. The king's expression didn't soften, but the crushing pressure in the air lessened by a fraction. "Kelrick," he said. His voice was not a shout, but a low rumble that vibrated through the ground, through the soles of my feet, and up into my bones. It was the sound of rocks grinding together deep within the earth. The boy, Kelrick, whimpered and squeezed my hand tighter. He pressed his face into the back of my thigh, trying to make himself smaller. King Theron's gaze shifted back to me. This time, it was not dismissive. The full weight of his attention fell upon me, and it was like being pinned by a physical force. His nostrils flared subtly. I knew what he was doing. He was reading me, dissecting my scent, and finding nothing. I saw the flicker of confusion in those silver depths. He was expecting the reek of terror from an omega, the scent of a kidnapper. Something. Anything. But my defective biology gave him only the faintest hint of chamomile and a whole lot of nothing. It was like shouting into a void. "Step away from him," the king commanded, his voice dropping into that soft, dangerous growl that promised violence. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. My mind was a whirlwind of terror, but the small, trembling body pressed against me was a fixed point. He was lost, I stammered, my voice a pathetic squeak. He was crying. I did not ask for an explanation. His eyes narrowed. I gave you a command. He took a step forward. I flinched, instinctively tightening my grip on Kelrick's hand. The boy chose that moment to peek out from behind me. He looked at the colossal, intimidating figure of his father, then at me. His little face was still stained with tears, but the stark terror was gone, replaced by a stubborn sort of defiance. He let go of my hand, took a wobbly step forward, and pointed a small, grubby finger at me. King Theron's eyes followed the gesture, a muscle feathering in his jaw. I braced myself, certain the boy was about to accuse me, to seal my fate. Instead, Kelrick's voice, though small, was shockingly clear in the heavy silence. "Mama," he said. The word hung in the air between us, a fragile, impossible thing. The king froze mid-stride. His silver eyes widened, the fierce certainty in them fracturing into stunned disbelief. He stared at his son, then his gaze snapped back to me, sharp and interrogating, as if I had somehow orchestrated this. Kelrick, seeming to sense he had his father's full attention, took another step and did something that made my heart stop altogether. He reached out, not for his father, but for me. He grabbed my hand again, holding it tightly, and looked back at the king. "Mama," he repeated, his tone firm, possessive. He tugged me forward slightly, a clear invitation for me to stand by his side. For a long moment, nobody moved. The king, the boy, and the broken Omega, a tableau of impossibility under the cold, indifferent stars. The scent of pine and sovereign power was still overwhelming, but now it was laced with something else. A thread of utter, profound confusion. King Theron looked at his son, whose amber eyes were fixed on him, and then at me, the scentless nobody who had somehow, in the space of 10 minutes, been claimed by the royal heir. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The most powerful lichen in the world was, for the first time in my living memory, utterly speechless. He lowered his gaze to where his son's small hand was clasped firmly in mine, and a low, rumbling sound escaped his chest. It wasn't a growl of anger. It was a sound of pure, bewildered awe. The silence stretched, taut and humming with unspoken questions. King Theron's silver eyes were still fixed on our joined hands, his powerful form rigid with shock. He was a creature of order and absolute control, and this was chaos. His son, his heir, Kelric, who, according to the whispers that reached even my lonely cabin, was a troubled and withdrawn child, had just called a stranger Mama. Not just any stranger, but me. A scentless, worthless Omega, hiding from the very society he ruled. What did you do to him? Theron's voice was low, the growl returning, but it was laced with a thread of something other than menace. It was caution. He was approaching a situation he did not understand, and it made him dangerous. Nothing, I whispered, my throat tight. I heard him crying. I came out. He took my hand. The explanation sounded feeble even to my own ears. Theron's gaze lifted from our hands and met mine. He took a slow, deliberate step closer, and then another. He was so near now I could feel the heat radiating from his body. The sheer scale of him was dizzying. I had to crane my neck to look up at his face. He lowered his head, his silver eyes searching my face for any sign of deception, any flicker of witchcraft or foul play. His scent was a physical presence, wrapping around me, sinking into my clothes, my skin. It should have been terrifying, and it was, but beneath the crushing dominance there was that scent of pine and clean earth, something solid and real that anchored me instead of drowning me. He inhaled deeply, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. I saw the minute furrowing of his brow as he processed my scent, or rather, the lack of it. You are muted, he murmured, more to himself than to me. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a strange curiosity. I'm broken, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. It was the truth I had lived with my whole life. A flicker of something, annoyance, disagreement, crossed his face. You are not broken. The statement was flat, absolute. Before I could process it, he crouched down, bringing himself to his son's eye level. The movement was fluid, impossibly graceful for a man so large. All the intimidating power was suddenly focused, gentled. Kelric, he said, his voice softer now, stripped of the commanding growl. This is not your mother. You know that. Kelric shook his head stubbornly, his grip on my hand tightening. He pressed himself closer to my leg. She's warm, he mumbled, his face half hidden. You're loud. The words, a child's simple truth, seemed to strike the king like a physical blow. A shadow of pain, deep and ancient, passed through his silver eyes. He looked from his son's averted face to my own, and for the first time, I saw past the terrifying monarch to the burdened father beneath. The whispers were true then. The bond between them was strained. The king's immense power, his loudness, as Kelric put it, was too much for the boy. You will both come with me, Theron said, his voice regaining its authority. It was not a request. He stood, his gaze sweeping over my tattered dress and bare feet with a flicker of distaste before settling on my face. Now, panic flared anew. To the village? The choosing? The choosing is of no concern to you. He cut me off, his tone leaving no room for argument. You are under my protection. No one will touch you. He looked at Kelrick. And you will not be leaving my sight again. He turned and began walking back the way he came, not waiting to see if I would follow. He knew I had no choice. Kelrick, still holding my hand, trotted to keep up, pulling me along with him. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Under his protection? What did that mean? I was being taken from my hovel, from my quiet, miserable safety, and dragged into the very heart of the world I had tried so desperately to escape. The walk to the edge of the forest was a blur of shadows and the thunderous beat of my own blood in my ears. Theron moved with a predatory silence, while Kelrick and I stumbled in his wake. As we neared the village, the sounds and smells became overwhelming. The roar of the bonfires, the cacophony of voices and laughter, and the thick, heady scent of 100 wolves in close quarters. It was a sensory assault that made me feel dizzy and sick. We didn't enter the main clearing. Theron led us along a shadowed path that skirted the celebration, heading towards the imposing stone structure that dominated the village, the Great Keep. Royal guards, clad in black leather and steel, materialized from the shadows as we approached. They bowed, their heads, their eyes wide with surprise as they took in the sight of their king, his lost son, and the ragged, unknown female being towed along by the prince. Inside, the keep was a world away from my cabin. Torches burned in iron sconces, casting a warm golden glow on stone walls hung with rich tapestries. The air was clean, smelling of beeswax, old stone, and the lingering scent of the king's power. We were led not to the dungeons as I had feared, but up a winding stone staircase to what were clearly the royal chambers. Theron dismissed the guards with a flick of his hand and led us into a vast fire-lit study. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound tomes. A massive oak desk stood before a window overlooking the valley, and a plush fur rug was spread before a crackling hearth. It was a room of quiet, immense power. Kelrick, finally releasing my hand, ran to the hearth and curled up on the rug, his eyes already heavy with sleep. The warmth and safety of the keep had finally exhausted him. "Sit," Theron commanded, gesturing to one of 2 high-backed chairs near the fire. I obeyed numbly, perching on the edge of the plush velvet cushion. I felt utterly out of place, a field mouse in a lion's den. Theron did not sit. He prowled the room, a caged predator, his silver eyes never leaving me. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Kelrick's soft breathing. "Tell me your name," he said at last, his voice low. "Mirren." "Mirren," he repeated, tasting the name. "And you are of the Blackwood pack?" I nodded, my gaze fixed on my hands, which were twisting in my lap. They don't claim me. I live on the mountain." "Because you are scentless," he stated. The word, spoken in his deep, rumbling voice, didn't sound like an insult. It sounded like a diagnosis. I flinched nonetheless. "Broken," I corrected him softly. "Stop saying that," he growled, a flash of impatience in his eyes. He stopped his pacing and stood directly in front of me, forcing me to look up at him. "There are old legends, stories my mother used to tell, of women born under a silent moon, women whose scent was a whisper, not a shout. They were not broken, they were called anchors." My head snapped up. Anchor? The word meant nothing to me. "Our kind," he continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone as if speaking to a student. "We are creatures of passion, of instinct. Our wolves are always close to the surface. That power, it creates a loudness, A storm inside. He glanced at his sleeping son. For some, that storm is too strong. It threatens to break them, to pull them under, to make them feral. An anchor, a moon speaker, the old texts called them, has a quiet that can calm the storm, a silence that can soothe the beast without chains or submission. My mind was reeling. Moon speaker? This was the stuff of children's tales, of forgotten myths. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be me. I don't understand, I stammered. Theron's gaze dropped to my chest, to the silver pendant that lay against my skin. What is that? It was my mother's, I said, my hand instinctively covering it. Let me see it. It was a command, but his voice was softer now. Hesitantly, I lifted the chain over my head. My fingers trembled as I held it out to him. He didn't take it from me. Instead, he crouched again, his large calloused fingers gently turning the pendant over in my palm. His touch was surprisingly light, sending a jolt of warmth through my skin that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the strange hum I'd felt with Kelrick. The crescent moon, he murmured, tracing the etching with his thumb. And the star. This is the mark of the moonspeaker lineage. It was thought to be lost for generations. He looked up, his silver eyes boring into mine. The confusion was gone, replaced by a stunning, piercing certainty. Your mother. Did she know what you were? My mother's last words echoed in my head. Your silence is not a weakness. It is a shield. They will not hear you. They will feel you. Tears pricked my eyes. I think she tried to tell me. I didn't understand. Theron stood, a look of profound, grim satisfaction on his face. She was trying to protect you. An ability like this. In the wrong hands, it is a weapon, a way to control and dominate. By letting the world think you were broken, she kept you safe. He looked over at Kelrick again, and the hard lines of his face softened with a raw, paternal pain. My son. His mother was a powerful alpha from the north. I thought the match would create a strong heir. Instead, their combined power created a conflict within him. His wolf is tearing him apart from the inside. He cannot control his shifts. They are agonizing for him. The pack healers can do nothing. They say he will not survive to adulthood. He will either burn out or become feral. The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw with a father's deepest fear. This mighty king, this terrifying ruler, was helpless to save his own child. He turned back to me, his expression stripped of all pretense, all royalty. It was the desperate plea of a father. When you touched him, Mirren, I felt it, the storm in him. It quieted. For the first time since he was a babe, there was peace in him. He called you Mama because your presence feels like the safety and comfort he has never known. My head was spinning. Everything I had ever believed about myself was being systematically dismantled. I wasn't broken. I was a myth, a legend, a cure. I am offering you a choice, he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its formal authority, but the desperation still underscored every word. It is not the choice of a mate or a claimed omega. It is a proposition. Stay here, in this keep. Be my son's guardian. Your defect is the only thing that can save him. In return, you will have my absolute protection. You will have wealth, comfort, status. No one will ever call you broken again. You will be honored as what you are. He paused, his silver eyes intense. I cannot force you. The old texts say an anchor's gift must be given freely, or it will curdle and fail. So I ask you, Mirren, last of the moon speakers, will you help me save my son? The choice he offered was no choice at all. Return to my hovel, to a life of cold, lonely misery, waiting for the day my pack decided I was too much of a burden to keep hiding. Or stay here, in this warm, opulent prison, and become the guardian of a prince and the last hope of a king? My entire life I had been nothing, a ghost, a flaw. Now I was being told I was essential. The validation was a heady, terrifying drink. Hope, an emotion I had long since starved, began to unfurl in my chest. I looked from the king's desperate, hopeful face to the small boy sleeping peacefully by the fire, a peace I had apparently given him. My mother's words finally clicked into place. This was the time she had spoken of. This was the moment my shield was meant to become something more. Taking a deep breath, I met the king's gaze. My voice, when it came, was still quiet. But for the first time in my life, it was steady. "Yes," I said, "I will stay." The relief that washed over King Theron's face was so profound, it was like watching a mountain shrug off a glacier. The immense tension he carried seemed to lessen, the harsh lines around his eyes softening. He gave a single, sharp nod, the king reasserting himself over the father. "Good," he said, the word a low rumble of satisfaction. "A handmaiden will be assigned to you. You will be given rooms adjoining my own, so you may be near Kaelric. Your every need will be met." He paused, his silver eyes holding mine. "My name is Theron. You will call me by it when we are in private." The intimacy of the suggestion sent a strange flutter through my stomach. Just a day ago, I was a forgotten outcast. Now I was on a first-name basis with the Lycan King. The world had tilted on its axis, and I was struggling to find my balance. As if summoned by his will, a soft knock came at the door. Theron called for them to enter, and a young woman with a kind face and warm brown eyes stepped inside, bowing deeply. She carried a bundle of folded fabrics in her arms. "Mirren, this is Thalira," Theron said. "She will attend you. Thalira, this is Lady Mirren. She is a guest of the crown and Kaelric's guardian. You will see to it that she is treated with the utmost respect." Lady Mirren. The title was so foreign, so absurd that I almost laughed. Thalira's eyes widened for a fraction of a second as she took in my ragged state, but her training was impeccable. She simply bowed her head again. "My lady," she murmured, "it is an honor. Take her to the Rosewood Chambers, see that she has a bath and clothes and food, anything she requires," Theron commanded. He then crouched and gently lifted the sleeping Kaelric into his massive arms. The boy stirred, murmuring in his sleep, and nestled his head against his father's broad shoulder. For a moment, with the firelight softening his harsh features and his son held securely in his arms, Theron looked less like a fearsome monarch and more like any father in the world. He looked at me over Kaelric's head. "Rest, Mirren. Tomorrow, your duties begin." His gaze was intense, a silent promise of the protection he'd offered, and something more, something I couldn't yet name. Thalira led me from the study into a world of impossible luxury. The Rosewood Chambers were not rooms, they were a suite. A sitting room with velvet chairs and a small fireplace, a bedroom with a bed so large and soft it looked like a cloud, and a bathing chamber with a copper tub big enough to swim in. Steam was already rising from it, scented with lavender and rose, while I soaked in the heavenly heat, scrubbing away the grime of the mountain and the scent of my old life. Thalira laid out a simple but elegant nightgown of soft cotton. She was quiet and efficient, her presence unobtrusive, but I could feel her curiosity like a palpable thing. "The king," I began, then stopped, unsure what to ask. Thalira's hands paused in their folding of my old tattered dress. "His Majesty has not been the same since the Queen died in childbirth," she offered softly, her eyes full of a sympathy that seemed genuine. "And Prince Kaelric. He has been a great sorrow to him. We have all prayed for a miracle." Her gaze met mine in the reflection of the polished copper tub. "Perhaps you are it." I had no answer for that. I was no miracle. I was just Mirren. But as I slipped into the clean nightgown and slid between sheets that felt like spun silk, I couldn't deny the flicker of hope that had been kindled in the ashes of my old life. I was warm, I was clean, and I was safe. For the first time I could remember, I fell asleep, without fear. The next few days passed in a surreal haze. I woke to find a wardrobe filled with beautiful, simple gowns in soft blues and greens. I ate meals served on porcelain plates, food so delicious and plentiful I felt guilty with every bite. But my time was not my own. It belonged to Kaelric. The boy was my shadow. From the moment he woke, he sought me out, his small hand finding mine as if by instinct. We walked in the castle's walled garden, his chatter filling the silence I was so accustomed to. He showed me his favorite flowers, a secret hiding place behind a stone bench, the spot where a robin had built its nest. With me, he was just a boy, bright, curious, and happy. The haunted, withdrawn look I'd first seen was gone, replaced by a light I was told no one had seen in him before. The hum I felt when we touched was constant, a low, steady current of peace that flowed from me to him. I didn't have to do anything. I just had to be there. My mere presence was his anchor. Theron watched us. He never intruded, but I always felt his presence. A flicker of movement in a high window, his powerful scent on the breeze, a sudden stillness that announced his proximity. During meals, which we took together in a private dining room, he would observe Kelric's easy laughter and the way the boy would lean against my side, his silver eyes holding a mixture of gratitude, awe, and an unnerving intensity when they turned to me. The court, however, was a different matter. News of my presence had spread like wildfire, the scentless Omega from the mountains, plucked from obscurity and installed in the royal wing. I was a curiosity, a scandal. When I walked the halls with Kelric, conversations would cease. I felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, the burn of their whispered speculation. Thalira was my shield, her calm demeanor and respectful address a clear signal of the king's favor, but it did little to quell the tide of gossip. The true test came a week after my arrival. Theron announced that Lord Valerius of the Northern Fangs and his daughter, Lady Cyrilda, would be extending their stay. They had been the favored candidates for a royal alliance before my sudden appearance. Valerius was a powerful, traditionalist alpha, and his daughter was everything I was not. A high-ranking beta of impeccable lineage, beautiful, confident, and drenched in the rich, intoxicating scent of jasmine and ambition. A formal banquet was held in their honor. Thalira helped me dress in a simple gown of deep sapphire blue that brought out the gray in my eyes. She arranged my hair in a simple braid, leaving the moon pendant as my only adornment. "Just stay near the king and the prince," she advised, her voice low. "They are your shield." Walking into the great hall on Theron's arm, a concession he'd insisted upon for Kelric's sake, who refused to enter without me, was the most terrifying experience of my life. The room was a kaleidoscope of color and a cacophony of sound. But the scent was the worst part. A thick, choking miasma of competing alpha pheromones, of perfumes and anxieties and arousal. It was a language I couldn't speak, a battle I was not equipped to fight. I felt my own meager scent shrink to nothing, and I fought the urge to turn and flee back to the safety of my rooms. Theron's hand tightened on my elbow, his touch a firm, grounding pressure. "Breathe, Mirren," he murmured, his voice a low rumble meant only for me. "You are with me. You are safe." We made our way to the high table. Kelric immediately scrambled into the seat beside mine, ignoring the one placed for him next to his father. Lord Valerius, a man with a cruel slash of a mouth and cold, calculating eyes, watched our procession with thinly veiled contempt. But it was his daughter, Cyrilda, who aimed the first dart. She was stunning, a vision in crimson silk, her black hair piled in an elaborate coronet of braids. She rose as we approached, her smile a beautiful predatory thing, her eyes, the color of dark chocolate, swept over me in a deliberately insulting appraisal. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice like honey laced with poison. She dipped into a flawless curtsy before her gaze landed on me. "And you have brought the nursemaid. How practical." A ripple of snickers went through the nearby tables. I flushed, my hands clenching into fists in the folds of my gown. The word nursemaid was a calculated insult, reducing my role to that of a common servant. Before I could stammer a response, or before Theron's low growl could escalate, I felt a small tug on my sleeve. It was Kelrick. He was looking at Cyrilda with an unnerving intensity, his amber eyes beginning to shimmer with that volatile light. The air around him crackled with nascent power. "She is not a nursemaid," Kelrick said, his voice small but clear. "She is my Mirren." Cyrilda's perfect smile faltered. To be contradicted by the child she was so clearly trying to impress was a setback she hadn't anticipated. She tried to recover, forcing a light laugh. "Of course, little prince, you're Mirren." She said my name as if it were a piece of dirt she'd found on her shoe. She turned her full attention to Theron. "My father and I were just discussing the instability in the Eastern Territories. A firm hand is needed. An alliance with the North would send a powerful message." It was a blatant political move, a public reminder of what she and her father offered: strength, stability, an alliance of equals. Everything I was not. I felt a pang of my old insecurity, the familiar feeling of being inadequate, out of place. I was just a girl from a ruined cabin. These people spoke of alliances and territories, a world I knew nothing about. I started to shrink into myself, to make myself smaller, when I felt Theron's hand cover mine where it rested on the table. His touch was warm, solid. His thumb stroked the back of my hand once, a gesture of silent, unwavering support. Bolstered by his touch, I looked up and met Cyrilda's smug gaze. I remembered my mother's words. "Your silence is not a weakness." I remembered Theron's. "You are an anchor." I was not here to play their games of power and scent. I had a different purpose. "A firm hand is not always a steady one, Lady Cyrilda," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the lull of conversation. "Sometimes a storm requires not a fist, but a calm harbor." A shocked silence fell over the high table. Cyrilda's jaw tightened, the color rising in her cheeks. I had not only answered her, but I had done so using a metaphor that, to those who understood the rumors about Kelrick, was a direct and pointed statement of my own value. Lord Valerius's eyes narrowed into slits, his mask of civility slipping to reveal the cold fury beneath. Theron did not smile, but the pressure of his hand on mine increased for a fraction of a second. It was enough. It was everything. He then turned his cool, silver gaze upon Cyrilda. "Lady Mirren is correct," he said, his voice ringing with royal authority. "Strength is not merely about dominance, it is also about balance." He lifted my hand, the one he was still holding, and brought it to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to my knuckles. It was not the gesture of a king to a servant. It was the gesture of a man to his chosen partner. "Which is why she is not the nursemaid. She is my guest of honor." The gasp that went through the hall was audible. It was a public declaration, a line drawn in the sand. He had chosen me, the scentless nobody, over the pristine and powerful Lady Cyrilda. The look of pure, venomous hatred she shot me across the table was so intense, it was like a physical blow. The battle had been joined, and I had just survived the first volley. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Cyrilda and her father were not the kind to accept defeat gracefully. The war had just begun. The banquet was a new kind of torture. Every eye was on me, every whisper a dissection of my past, my purpose, my relationship with the king. Cyrilda, recovering her composure, engaged Theron in a relentless stream of political talk, her words sharp and intelligent, designed to highlight her knowledge and my ignorance. She spoke of trade routes, border disputes, and ancient blood feuds, her voice a constant, confident murmur at Theron's side. Lord Valerius watched me with the cold, patient stillness of a wolf waiting for a rabbit to break cover. I felt myself shrinking again, the sapphire gown feeling like a costume I had no right to wear. I focused on Kelric, cutting his meat into small pieces, ensuring his goblet was filled with water instead of wine. It was a simple, maternal act that grounded me. This was my purpose here. Not to debate treaties, but to guard this small, precious life. Whenever I felt the weight of their judgment become too much, I would feel the warmth of Theron's leg pressed against mine under the table, a silent, constant reminder that I was not alone. He would occasionally turn from his conversation with Cyrilda to ask me a simple question: "Is the venison to your liking, Mirren?" Or, "Kelric seems to enjoy the honey cakes," pulling me back into the circle of his attention, forcing the others to acknowledge my presence. Each time, Cyrilda's smile would grow a little tighter, her eyes a little colder. The evening finally drew to a close. As the guests began to depart, Theron stood, his hand finding the small of my back. "Walk with me," he commanded softly. It was an order for me, but a dismissal for everyone else. He led me, with Kelric sleepily trailing, beside us, out of the stuffy great hall, and onto a wide stone balcony that overlooked the castle gardens. The night air was cool and clean, a welcome relief from the cloying scents of the banquet. The twin moons cast a silvery glow over the manicured hedges and sleeping rose bushes. "You were magnificent," Theron said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. I gave a short, bitter laugh. I was terrified. She is everything a queen should be. I am nothing. "Do not ever say that," he said, turning to face me. He placed his hands on my shoulders, his grip firm. "She is a finely crafted sword, all sharp edges and polished steel. She knows how to cut, how to threaten, how to command. You, Mirren, you are the shield. You know how to protect, how to endure, how to heal. Which do you think is more valuable to a king who is also a father?" His words were a balm on my frayed nerves. I looked up at him, at his face cast in the ethereal moonlight. The harsh lines seemed softer, the silver of his eyes deeper, more thoughtful. My heart did a strange, stuttering dance in my chest. "They hate me," I whispered. "Valerius and Cyrilda, they will not let this go." "I know," he said, his expression hardening. "Valerius sees power as a thing to be taken by force. He believes my concern for Kelric is a weakness he can exploit. He wants to see my son fail, to prove me an unfit king so he can make his move." His hands tightened on my shoulders. "That is why you are in more danger than you can imagine. You are not just a romantic rival to Cyrilda. You are the one thing that can foil her father's ambitions. You are the key to my son's stability, and therefore, to the stability of my reign." A cold dread washed over me. This was not just about courtly insults and social maneuvering. This was about the throne itself. I was a pawn in a very dangerous game. "You must not leave my side, or Kelric's," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, serious growl. "Do you understand me? You will not go anywhere in this keep alone." "I understand," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He looked down at me, his gaze intense. "Look at me, Mirren." I met his eyes, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between us. "I will not let them harm you. You are under my protection. What is mine, I protect." The possessiveness in his tone should have frightened me. It was the raw, primal instinct of an alpha claiming his territory. But intertwined with it was a fierce protectiveness that felt less like ownership and more like a vow. It made me feel safer than I had ever felt in my life. The next few days were tense. The court was a hotbed of whispers and alliances. Cyrilda was a constant, smiling threat, her every word a carefully veiled insult, her every glance a promise of retribution. Lord Valerius was more direct. He sought to challenge Theron's authority in small ways, questioning his judgment in open council, making pointed remarks about the strength of the Northern Fang's armies. His true target, however, was Kelric. And through Kelric, me. The attack came during a public training session. Theron, wanting to show his son's progress, had brought Kelric to the training grounds to watch the Royal Guard practice their drills. I stood with them on a raised platform, Kelric's hand held firmly in mine. The yard was filled with the clang of steel, the shouts of men, and the scent of sweat and exertion. Lord Valerius and Cyrilda were also in attendance, watching from across the yard. I saw Valerius speaking in low tones to a massive, scarred alpha beside him, a brute named Vornak whose scent was a rancid mix of stale blood and aggression. Vornak's gaze kept flicking towards Kelric, a cruel smirk on his lips. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. The demonstration began. The guards moved with precision, their swords a blur of silver in the midday sun. Kelric watched, his amber eyes wide with fascination. He was calm, his energy stable, the hum between us a gentle, steady rhythm. Then, it happened. On a signal from Valerius, Vornak deliberately broke formation. With a roar, he manifested his wolf, a monstrous, mangy beast with matted gray fur and crazed yellow eyes. But the shift was wrong. It was wild, uncontrolled. He charged not towards his sparring partner, but directly towards the platform where we stood. Chaos erupted. Guards shouted, drawing their weapons. But the feral wolf was too fast. It was a blur of gray fur and snapping teeth, its target clear, the young prince. Theron moved like lightning, placing himself between us and the charging beast, his body transforming as he moved. Fur sprouted, bones cracked and reformed. In seconds, the king was gone, replaced by a colossal shadow wolf, its fur the color of midnight, its silver eyes glowing with incandescent rage. But Vornak's attack wasn't aimed at the king. It was a provocation. The sight of the feral wolf, the raw, uncontrolled violence, the wave of pure killing intent that rolled off it. It struck Kelric like a physical blow. The boy screamed, a high, terrified sound. The gentle hum between us shattered. I felt the storm inside him break its leash. His small body convulsed, his amber eyes blazing with uncontrolled power. His skin flickered, becoming translucent, the shadow of a small, terrified wolf visible beneath. He was losing control, his own wolf lashing out in terror, threatening to consume him. Theron was caught. He was poised to intercept Vornak, but he couldn't leave his son's side. He was frozen between two threats, his own desperate howl of rage and fear tearing through the air. In that moment of chaos, everything slowed down. The shouts, the fear, the snarling of the wolves. It all faded into a dull roar. All I could see was Kelric, his small body being torn apart by a power he couldn't contain. All I could feel was his terror, his pain. My mother's voice whispered in my memory, "They will not hear you. They will feel you." Instinct took over. There was no thought, no decision. I dropped to my knees in front of Kelric, ignoring the charging monster, ignoring the king's battle. I placed both my hands on the boy's small, trembling chest. I closed my eyes and didn't just focus on the hum between us. I became the hum. I poured all of my will, all of my essence into that connection. I imagined my silence not as an absence, but as a presence, a vast, calm, quiet space, a harbor. I mentally reached for the raging storm inside Kelric and pulled. I did not fight it. I did not try to cage it. I simply opened the door to my own inner quiet and invited it in. A wave of energy, wild and hot and chaotic, flooded into me. It was like trying to drink the ocean. For a second, I thought it would overwhelm me, tear me apart. But my own core, the silent, steady place within me that the world had called broken, held firm. It absorbed the storm, gentled the waves, and quieted the thunder. My pendant grew warm against my skin, then hot, glowing with a soft, silvery light that was visible even through the fabric of my dress. A pulse of energy, cool and serene as moonlight, flowed from the pendant, through me, and into Kaelric. The boy's convulsions stopped. The frantic flickering of his form ceased. He gasped, a deep, shuddering breath, and his eyes, when he opened them, were no longer blazing with feral light. They were just the clear, intelligent amber of a little boy. He looked at me, his expression one of dazed wonder, and collapsed into my arms, boneless and exhausted. I opened my eyes. The entire training yard was frozen in stunned silence. Theron, in his massive wolf form, stood over the whimpering, subdued form of Vornak, a single black paw on the lesser wolf's throat. But his glowing silver eyes were fixed on me and his son. Lord Valerius stood gaping, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His plan had not just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. He had meant to expose Kelric's weakness and my incompetence. Instead, in front of the entire royal guard, I had performed a miracle. I had not just proven the legends true, I had proven my worth. I had proven that I was indeed the anchor. And in doing so, I had just declared myself the most powerful enemy Lord Valerius and his daughter had ever faced. The look in his eyes promised that his next attack would not be so public, and it would be aimed squarely at me. I was drained, my body trembling with the aftershocks of channeling so much raw power. Kelric was a heavy, warm weight in my arms, his soft breathing a reassuring rhythm against my chest. The silence in the training yard was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of Vornak pinned beneath Theron's paw. Theron's form shifted, the massive shadow wolf receding back into the man. He stood, his chest heaving, his eyes still locked on me. He crossed the distance between us in 3 long strides and dropped to one knee before me, his gaze sweeping over Kelric, assuring himself that his son was truly unharmed. "He's just sleeping," I whispered, my voice hoarse. Theron reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and brushed a stray lock of hair from my forehead. His touch was reverent. The raw gratitude in his silver eyes was so intense it was overwhelming. He looked at me not as a king, not as an alpha, but as a father whose deepest prayer had just been answered. "You saved him," he breathed, the words full of awe. Lord Valerius finally found his voice. "A trick!" he spat, his face mottled with rage. "Some sort of Omega witchery. She is a danger to the boy. A corrupting influence." Theron rose to his full, intimidating height, his gaze snapping to Valerius. The air crackled with his fury. "You will be silent, Valerius," he growled, his voice lethally soft. "You staged this. You used a feral wolf to attack my son. You endangered the heir to the throne." He gestured to the guards who had surrounded the still cowering Vornak. "Take this filth to the dungeons and confine Lord Valerius and his daughter to their quarters. They will answer for this act of treason." Cyrilda, who had been watching with a horrified expression, rushed forward. "Father meant no harm, Your Majesty. It was a misunderstanding. Vornak lost control, that is all." "The only misunderstanding," Theron said, his voice like ice, "is your belief that I am a fool." He turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and focused entirely on me. Gently, he lifted Kaelric from my arms, cradling him with an ease that belied the boy's weight. With his other hand, he reached for mine, lacing his fingers through my own. "Come," he said softly. You need to rest. He led me away from the training yard, leaving the guards to deal with the sputtering lord and his daughter. He did not release my hand. His grip was a firm, protective anchor in the swirling sea of my exhaustion and shock. We walked in silence through the castle halls, a strange procession. The king, his sleeping son, and the exhausted Omega who had just saved them both. The court members we passed flattened themselves against the walls, their eyes wide, their sense a mixture of fear and awe. The whispers that followed us now were of a different sort entirely. He didn't take me to my chambers. He took me back to his study, the room where this new life had begun. He laid Kelrick gently on the fur rug before the fire, then guided me to one of the large chairs and pushed me gently into it. He poured a glass of water from a carafe on his desk and pressed it into my hands. Drink, he commanded. I obeyed, the cool water soothing my dry throat. He knelt before me, taking the empty glass and setting it aside. He took both of my hands in his thumbs stroking the backs of them. I have spent 5 years in terror, he said, his voice raw with a vulnerability I had never heard before. Every day I have watched my son suffer. I have listened to healers tell me there is no hope. I have felt his wolf rage against him, and I have been powerless to stop it. He looked up, his silver eyes shining with unshed tears. My own power, the very thing that should protect him, only makes it worse. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. I have been his poison. The confession was a blade to the heart. This powerful, untouchable king saw himself as a danger to his own child. The loneliness and burden he carried were immense, a mountain of grief and fear he had borne all by himself. Today, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, I watched him being torn apart, and for a moment, I was frozen. I could fight the beast in front of me, but I could not fight the one inside of him. And then you did what I, with all my strength and authority, could not. You quieted the storm. You gave him peace. He squeezed my hands. How can I ever repay such a debt? It is not a debt, I said softly, finding my voice. I love him. The words were a simple, unadorned truth. In the short time I had known him, the bright, brave little boy had captured my heart completely. Theron's breath hitched. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. Mirren. He whispered my name like a prayer. He raised a hand and gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The calloused skin was rough, but the gesture was infinitely tender. When I found you in that forest, I thought I had found a solution to my problem. A tool. A means to an end. His gaze deepened, the silver of his eyes swirling with a storm of its own, but this was not a storm of power, it was a storm of emotion. I was wrong. I did not find a tool. I found a miracle. I found you. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I was mesmerized, caught in the gravity of his presence, in the raw honesty of his confession. The scent of pine and earth and lightning filled my senses, but now it was familiar, comforting, a scent I was beginning to associate with safety, with him. His lips met mine. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of reverence. It was soft, questioning, a whisper of a touch that sent a shiver down my entire body. The hum, the quiet energy I shared with Kelrick sparked between us, but it was different, deeper, stronger. It was a chord of harmony that resonated in the very core of my being. I leaned into the kiss, my hand coming up to rest on his chest, over his heart. I could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath my palm. He responded, his arm wrapping around my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. The kiss deepened, becoming something more, something filled with all the loneliness he had carried, all the hope I had given him, and a dawning, breathtaking desire that left me breathless. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathing heavily. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. "Don't hide from me, Mirren," he murmured, the familiar words taking on an entirely new meaning. He wasn't talking about my old cabin on the mountain. He was talking about the walls I kept around my heart. Not anymore. In the days that followed, everything changed. Lord Valerius and Cyrilda were sent back to their northern lands in disgrace, their plot exposed. Vornak was executed for treason. The court, ever fickle, now swarmed around me. Those who had sneered now bowed. Those who had whispered now offered fawning praise. I was no longer the broken Omega or the king's strange pet. I was the moon speaker, the lady anchor, Kelrick's savior. Theron moved me from the rosewood chambers into the queen's suite, which adjoined his own. It was a vast, beautiful space that had been sealed since his first mate's death. He had it completely refurbished for me, filled with books and soft fabrics and flowers from the garden. It was a statement to the entire kingdom. Our relationship deepened, settling into a new, intimate rhythm. We were rarely apart. We spent our days with Kelrick, a family in all but name. We spent our evenings in his study, talking for hours after Kelrick was asleep. He told me of his own childhood, of the weight of the crown being thrust upon him at a young age after his father was killed by feral wolves in the wilderness, a trauma that had fueled his terror for Kelrick's future. He spoke of his loneliness, of the isolation of being at the pinnacle of power, unable to show weakness or vulnerability to anyone. I, in turn, told him of my life, of the cold, the hunger, the crushing loneliness, of my mother's love and her cryptic final words. With him, I felt seen for the first time in my life. He didn't just see the moon speaker, he saw Mirren. He cherished my quiet nature, celebrated my gentle spirit, and found strength in my silence. His touches became more frequent, more familiar. A hand on my waist as we walked, his fingers lacing through mine during council meetings, a soft kiss pressed to my temple when he thought no one was looking. He desired me, that was clear, but he never pushed. He was waiting. He had offered me a choice once before, and he was honoring it still, allowing me to set the pace, to come to him in my own time. The final choice came on the night of the next full moon, a month after the attack. Theron called a formal court session in the throne room. He stood before the massive carved stone throne, with me and Kelrick standing on the dais beside him. He addressed the assembled lords and ladies of his kingdom, his voice ringing with power and clarity. He spoke of the recent treason, of the stability of the throne, and of the future of his line. For 5 years this kingdom has been without a queen, he announced, his silver eyes sweeping the room before landing on me. I have been urged to make an alliance, to choose a mate based on power and politics and bloodlines. His gaze flickered for a moment, a silent condemnation of Valerius's ambitions. But I have learned that the greatest strength is not always the one that makes the most noise. The most vital power is not always the one that is seen. It is the one that is felt. He turned to me, his expression softening, all the love and reverence he felt for me shining in his eyes for the entire world to see. He took my hand. This kingdom does not need another sword. It needs a shield. It does not need more loudness. It needs a quiet harbor. My son does not need a stepmother of convenience. He needs the woman he already calls Mama in his heart. He went down on one knee before me, the mighty Shadow Wolf King kneeling before the broken Omega. A collective gasp went through the room. I do not offer you the position of a claimed mate, bound by alpha law, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I offer you a partnership. I offer you a crown to wear beside my own. I offer you my heart, my strength, my protection, for all of our days. Mirren, last of the moon speakers, my anchor. Will you be my queen? Tears streamed down my face, but they were tears of joy, of a happiness so profound it felt like my heart would burst. I looked at this incredible man, this fierce king and gentle father, who saw not my flaws, but my strength. I looked at Kelrick, who was beaming at me, his amber eyes bright with pure joy. This was my home, this was my family, this was my purpose. Yes, I whispered, the word filled with all the love in my soul. Yes, Theron. He slid a simple, elegant ring of silver and moonstone onto my finger, a perfect match to my mother's pendant. As he stood and drew me into his arms for a kiss that sealed our promise before the entire kingdom, a cheer erupted through the throne room. Kelrick launched himself at us, wrapping his small arms around our legs in a fierce hug. Later that night, we stood on that same balcony where he had first promised me his protection. The full moon shone down, bathing the world in its serene, silver light. Theron's arms were wrapped around me from behind, his chin resting on my head. Kelrick was sleeping soundly in his own room, safe and at peace. I never imagined this, I murmured, looking out at the sprawling lands that were now mine to help protect. A life beyond that cabin. I never imagined a life beyond my fear, he confessed, his voice a low rumble against my back. You have given me back my hope, Mirren. You have given me back my son. He pressed a kiss to my hair. You have given me everything. I leaned back against his solid warmth, my hand covering his where it rested on my stomach. The moon pendant lay cool against my skin, a silent testament to a mother's love and a destiny fulfilled. I was no longer Mirren the broken. I was Mirren, the queen, the anchor, the moon speaker. I had been a ghost living in the shadows, and now I stood in the light, loved and essential. The future would hold challenges, I knew. The whispers from the north would not be silenced forever. But for the first time in my life, I was not afraid. I was home.